Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly beneath the sheepskins of a world where inheritance wasn't just about bloodlines and scrolls, but about whose body lay where and with whom under the moody candlelight of a Viking hall. You're standing barefoot on frost-kissed floorboards, the scent of pine smoke and salted fish curling up from the hearth. Outside, sleet lashes the longhouse roof like 1,000 tiny spears, but inside, it's warm, dim, and buzzing with gossip. Someone's son has just died mysteriously during a fishing trip. Someone else's daughter is pregnant again, with no husband in sight. And old Jarl Eirik, he just choked on a boiled sheep tongue before signing his will. That's going to be a problem. You feel the tension in the air like thick wool, woven with sex, suspicion, and the salty weight of property. Because in this world, who slept with whom wasn't just gossip, it was a legal matter. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You crouch into the smoky hall of a chieftain's death feast. The fire crackles at the center, casting long shadows across fur-lined benches. A woman weeps into her ale, though you're not sure whether it's for grief or performance. The eldest son, Sven, sits closest to the hearth, arms crossed, jaw clenched, already eyeing the best goats. His younger half-brother Leif hovers near the doorway, sharpening a knife a little too slowly. Then there's Freydis, the dead man's daughter, her lips pressed tight, eyes sharp as icicles. Everyone here knows she was her father's favorite. But favoritism means nothing without proof. And the only written will? It burned in the same fire that cooked last night's venison. This is where things get thorny. See, Viking law was part oral tradition, part who yells loudest at the thing assembly. Bloodlines mattered. Sure, but not just any blood. The legal blood had to come from a recognized union, which might be a formal wedding, or just a loudly proclaimed betting in front of witnesses. And this is where sex slithers in like a trickster god in the rafters. A child born of a bondmaid? He might be fed but not feared. A son conceived during a raid from a bride taken by force? His fate depends on whether the local gogi thinks the gods smiled on that union or spat on it. Historians still argue whether these rules were truly consistent across Viking lands, or whether they flexed with power, beauty, or the thickness of your beard. But what's clear is that sex wasn't just private pleasure, it was social currency. You didn't just inherit wealth through sex. You could inherit curses, vendettas, livestock, and the occasional half-built shipyard. A well-placed lover could be your will, your weapon, your wild card. And that's why tonight, we begin in the late autumn of 873 CE, when a widow named Astrid lays quietly next to her dead husband, pressing his cooling hand onto her stomach. She isn't mourning. She's strategizing. See, Astrid's been trying to conceive for 6 winters, and the old jarl, well, his longboat wasn't sailing like it used to. But a week ago, under the harvest moon, she took comfort with his nephew, a flax-haired skald named Bjorn, who sang about dragons and liked his mead warm. Now she feels a flutter in her belly, and if it's real, it could change everything. Because if she births a son and says it's the jarl's, she can claim the hall, the herd, even the thralls. If anyone doubts her, she simply nod and say he knew it was his. He touched me here before the gods took him. This kind of manipulation wasn't rare, it was a tactic. And Viking society, for all its axe-swinging masculinity, gave surprisingly wide berth to clever women who could work the system. Virginity was valuable, yes, but not as much as timing, testimony, and good bedside storytelling. The gods didn't judge morality the way we do today. Odin fathered dozens of demigods across 9 realms, many without asking permission. So a woman like Astrid wasn't breaking rules. She was playing a game with different stakes, and the rules were written. In lust, legend, and long memories, let's pause at this smoky crossroads and consider the linens. Yes, the sheets. In some Viking households, a blood-stained bedsheet from the wedding night was preserved like a sacred relic, not just to prove the bride's virtue, but to legally validate the legitimacy of future sons. If those sons later tried to claim inheritance, the family could literally unfurl the cloth and say, "Behold, the blood of our claim." Of course, that assumes the blood was real. There were tricks. Pig's blood, pricked fingers, or even red berries mashed into the weave. Virginity was a symbol, not a fact. And some girls learned early that a little performance art could go a long way. Sex, inheritance, and showmanship often danced together under their roof beams. One recorded case tells of a chieftain who publicly declared his favorite concubine's son as his rightful heir during a feast, no less by lifting the baby above the table and dropping honey on his forehead. The gesture was symbolic: sweet blessing, divine favor, public witness. But the man's legitimate wife stormed out, dragging her two pale, sneezing sons behind her. The village buzzed for weeks. That boy the honey head later became the region's most infamous land grabber. He ruled not by sword, but by seduction, whispering promises to elders and sleeping with the widows of his rivals. His nickname? The Tongue of Thor. Now think about this. Viking law sometimes allowed a child's name to determine their rank. If your father named you after a god, a hero, or even a favorable wind, it was seen as a prophecy. But what if he didn't name you at all? That happened too. In some cases, an unnamed child floated in legal limbo, neither inheritor nor bastard, neither recognized nor rejected. One midwife reportedly whispered a name into a newborn's ear before the father arrived, hoping to guide the child's fate. She was later accused of sorcery when that child claimed a cousin's inheritance and won. Did the whispered name count? Historians still argue whether midwife naming was legal in all regions, or only where ravens flew low. You can't help but smile a little at how ridiculous and relatable it all is. After all, modern families still argue over wills. But imagine if the outcome depended not on paperwork, but on whose body was warm in which bed, on what night, under what phase of the moon. Viking inheritance wasn't a spreadsheet. It was a slow-burn soap opera wrapped in mead breath, mossy sheets, and the soft creak of bunk beds that held more secrets than swords. And so, tonight, you press deeper into this world. The fire is burning low now. The guests are slipping into fur blankets. Outside, wolves howl under a swollen moon, and inside someone's quietly slipping into the wrong bed. It may not change the course of history, but it might change who gets the cows. You wake with the bitter aftertaste of mead still clinging to your tongue, and the sound of boots crunching on frost just outside the longhouse. Word travels fast here, especially when there's a body, a missing knife, and three siblings ready to slit each other's throats over a strip of forest and a pile of tarnished silver. The dead man Jarl Bjorn lies stiff near the fire, pit, mouth ajar like he's still trying to give orders. He was fine yesterday, laughing, burping, roaring at a skald's filthy song about a goat and a nun. But this morning, his blood's already settled into the furs beneath him, and his oldest son Sven is speaking with the grim clarity of someone who knows what he wants. Everything. The land, the livestock, the longhouse, even the hound. His sister Frady sits by the fire, sharpening a bone needle with unnerving precision. She doesn't speak. She doesn't need to. Everyone knows she was the one who wiped drool from their father's chin last week, who read him the runes when his eyes grew too cloudy, who held his hand and promised she'd make sure his legacy lived on. But promises are smoke without proof. And proof, in the Viking world, is rarely written. It's remembered, shouted, slept with. And that's where the real problem lies. their half-sister Inga, the daughter of a bondmaid, born after a thunderstorm and a midsummer feast, swaddled in linen that smelled of roast pig and regret. She has no legal standing, says Sven, no claim. Her mother was a servant. Her birth wasn't recorded at the thing. No one saw the bedding. But Inga stands tall, hair braided with amber beads, voice steady as she says, "He told me once I was his first joy." And just like that, the hall holds its breath. Because if Thorbjorn truly claimed her, even in passing, even in drunken affection, then she may have a right. Not to everything, maybe, but enough to matter. Enough to make Sven squirm. Now, here's where the saga gets slippery. Viking inheritance law had room for legitimate sons, acknowledged daughters, and sometimes even bastard children, if they were claimed. The trick was proving that claim, especially when the only witness might be a foggy memory or a slurred oath beside a dying fire. The law preferred sons born within marriage. But not all marriages were official. Some were handfastings, temporary unions, sometimes just a winter long. Others were simply public declarations of cohabitation. Still others began with a war raid and a shared blanket. What mattered most was recognition. Did the man accept the child as his own? Did the community believe him? Did the gods seem pleased, or at least not offended? Historians still argue whether the Thing assemblies took these oral claims seriously or treated them as convenient fiction. But what's clear is that inheritance was part truth, part performance, and part social theater. And like any good theater, it had props. One of the strangest involved teeth. Yes, teeth. In parts of Iceland, if a child's tooth resembled a father's crooked incisor or gap-toothed grin, neighbors might take that as a sign of blood. It wasn't legally binding, but it could sway the room. There's a record of a man who carved a tiny rune into his son's first baby tooth before burying it in the hearthstone, a symbolic gesture meant to anchor the boy's inheritance in the house's very bones. The house later burned down, but the boy lived on to inherit 3 goats and a widow with suspiciously strong arms. Which brings us to sex specifically, the kind that doesn't stay secret for long. The story of Freydis's mother is well known in the village, whispered like a bedtime curse. She was a healer, tall and solemn, with a voice like warm bread and a reputation for helping women avoid unwanted births with herbs and prayers. One winter night, when Jarl Thorbjorn was young and drunk and half-naked from a sauna, he wandered into her hut looking for firewood and left without his trousers. 9 months later, Freydis arrived. No wedding, no feast. Just a child born under the gaze of a snow owl and a kind of silence that settles like dust. Yet Thorbjorn let her stay. Let her call herself daughter. Even let her ride with him to the Thing one year, dressed like a boy, arguing with elders about sheep counts. That kind of half-recognition haunts inheritance battles. Freydis was never disowned, but she was never officially named either. Her mother died with only a single hair comb to her name. And now, with Thorbjorn gone, the question becomes, is affection a claim? Is loyalty a contract? Is the memory of a man's touch as strong as his written word? Of course, there are other ways to sway fate. In one erotic tale preserved from the 11th century, a woman named Svala seduced her dying husband's brother to convince him to swear she'd conceived just before her husband's death. Her method? A long oil massage, a verse of poetry, and a carefully planted letter she claimed was her husband's final declaration. The letter was fake. The oath was real. And her son? He grew up rich, arrogant, and fond of wearing silk tunics. Died with foreign spice. They called him Cinnamon. He died choking on a grape. These moments might sound absurd, but in the Viking world, absurdity and legitimacy walked hand in hand. Take the custom of bed oaths. If a dying man whispered a promise in bed and 2 people swore they heard it, it could override even an existing will. But what if the only other person in bed was a concubine, or worse, a slave. Some law codes allowed it, others didn't. The truth often depended on who you were, how popular you were, or how good your lover was at crying in public. And there's one more twist. Inheritance wasn't always about land or livestock. It could also include revenge. If you were cut out of a will you thought you'd earned, you might not sue. You might kill. A man named Rooney, whose saga survives in fragments, was denied his father's sword, the family's most prized possession. Instead, it was gifted to a merchant's son, rumored to be the jarl's secret favorite. Rooney challenged the boy to a duel, lost, and married his widow. 5 years later, he named his own son after the sword and quietly burned the merchant's warehouse. The ashes spelled out justice in runes. Or so the story goes. So here we are again, back in the longhouse. The flames crackle low, licking at the iron pot. Sven stands up, ready to speak his claim. Leif leans in, eyes sharp. Freydis taps, her needle against the table. Inga lifts her chin, defiant. Outside, the sleet has turned to snow. And somewhere, in the dark corners of memory and motive, Thorbjorn's voice echoes, not in words, but in the rustle of furs, the warmth of hands. Once held, the heat of moments that no law can truly capture. This isn't just inheritance. It's intimacy turned into argument. Love, lust, and legacy braided into one long tangled beard. The fire sputters as the room quiets, and all eyes turn to the shadow in the doorway. Leif, the younger son, Bjorn. Not of Thorbjorn's stoic wife, but of a red-cheeked baker's daughter whose name most people have forgotten, though everyone remembers the way she used to sing while kneading dough. Leif has never had the same seat at the table as Sven. Where Sven speaks like a chieftain in waiting, Leif speaks in questions, not commands. Where Sven swings an axe, Leif writes poems in the margins of firewood. But tonight, with the scent of roasted lamb thick in the air, and the jarl's breath no longer fogging the windows, Leif decides he's done being quiet. He steps forward and says, "He chose me once." He said, "The best part of me was an accident." The hall groans with the kind of tension that makes even the soup bowls tremble. You can feel it too, can't you? That pause when something too true is said too aloud. The law says Leif is a semi-acknowledged son, a term that drips with contempt. The Thing laws in Norway were clear. Sons born of unofficial unions, unless formally adopted, witnessed or blood-oathed, weren't full heirs. But Icelandic law was murkier. A man could claim a child at any point, publicly or privately, and that child's inheritance rights could shift accordingly, especially if the man gave gifts during life or whispered intentions on his deathbed. Historians still argue whether such recognition by gift had equal footing with legitimate birth, or if it was just an excuse for rich men to play favorites. But in Leif's case, there was a detail no one could ignore. Last spring, Thorbjorn gave him a ring. Not just any ring, a serpent-shaped one, passed through 3 generations, known to be enchanted by some drunken priest with a fondness for riddles. Thorbjorn gave it to Leif at the midsummer fire, in front of witnesses, saying only, "May this bite before it breaks." He didn't say inherit, he didn't say heir, but he didn't have to. Symbols meant everything. A ring could scream what a father wouldn't say. Leif now raises that hand, the silver catching firelight, and suddenly Sven looks like he's trying to swallow a rock. Because inheritance wasn't always about blood. Sometimes it was about who was loved just slightly more in a moment of vulnerability. And this is where we detour into a story buried in old parchment and newer gossip. The tale of Ulf the Sworn, a bastard who inherited an entire fishing village because he was born with a birthmark shaped like a wolf's fang. His mother claimed that Thrain, the village chief, had slept with her during a thunderstorm and that he'd cried out the name Ulf mid-climax. When challenged, she brought forth a leather pouch containing a scrap of his tunic, some herbs, and a blood-stained rabbit's foot as proof. The local Gogi, who was half blind and fully bored, ruled that the birthmark was obviously a divine signal, and Ulf inherited everything: nets, boats, even a one-eyed cat named Magnus. The catch? Ulf was terrible at fishing. He bankrupted the village, sold the boats for wine, and died choking on a shellfish. Still, the point remains, in Viking culture, signs mattered. Sex wasn't just about reproduction. It was about transaction, trust, and sometimes spectacle. And Leif's serpent ring is its own kind of spectacle, a token heavy with unspoken promises. Sven tries to dismiss it. It's a gift, a trinket. He gave rings to everyone. But Freydis cuts in, her voice like ice cracking on a pond. He never gave me one. Did he give you one? Silence answers. And in that silence, Leif finds breath, finds fire. He tells the story of a night too. Winters ago, when he stayed up with Thorbjorn through a fever, fed him broth, sang lullabies. Thorbjorn had called him my shadow son, and said that when the time came, the land would find its way to him. Freydis leans back, her eyes flick between her brothers. You can tell she's calculating, not just her odds, but her value. If she backs Leif, maybe she gets a share. Maybe she gets a favor. Maybe she avoids being married off to some oafish neighbor in exchange for 6 goats and a promise. Because that's the other side of Viking inheritance. It wasn't just about what you got, it was about what you avoided. Women could inherit, but only under conditions. Often only when there were no sons, or when they'd proven themselves unusually useful. Some sagas tell of daughters inheriting full estates after leading war parties, saving villages, or charming enough people to make their absence feel like a loss. Which brings us to the erotic story of the evening. You'll like this one. A woman named Brynja seduced her dying husband's cousin, not for love, not even for power, but to get access to a chest of documents that proved her sons were legitimate. The cousin had the key. She had the curves. 1 night of candlelight and 2 slow verses of a love poem later, she had the papers. Her sons inherited 2 farms, a storeroom, and a mare that once kicked a bishop. Brynja vanished soon after, leaving behind only a hairpin and a series of love notes hidden inside hollow bread loaves. Local lore claims she sailed west and opened a tavern in Greenland. The drinks were terrible. The stories were legendary. Back in the longhouse, Inga hasn't moved. She's watching all of it unfold like she's waiting for the real play to start. Her claim is weaker technically. Her mother never had recognition, and she wasn't named in any will. But Inga has something more dangerous than legitimacy. She has confidence, and she has secrets. Everyone in the room knows she was her father's listener. The one who brought him wine, who rubbed his shoulders, who heard him mutter in his sleep. And if she says he whispered her name on his last night, who's going to argue? Who will risk looking heartless in front of the elders? The dead are sacred here, and those close to them gain a strange kind of power dot, and so the inheritance dispute thickens. Not with lawyers or ledgers, but with stories. Whose story sounds truer? Whose performance earns more nods? Whose version of sex, affection, and legacy feels closest to the fire's warmth? The answers shift with every breath, every flicker of torchlight. You lean back, listening to the whispers, curling like smoke above the table, and realize this isn't a legal debate. It's theater, it's myth-making. It's a dance of ghosts and gestures, and everyone wants to lead. Outside, the wind howls like a scorned lover, scraping across the thatched roof with claws of ice. But inside the longhouse, the real storm is just beginning. You can taste it in the air, bitter as old mead, sharp as birch smoke. The kind of tension that rises not from swords, but from glances held a second too long. Freydis finally speaks, not with rage, but with a terrifying calm. If my blood isn't enough, then maybe the stories will be. And with that, she walks to the wall, reaches behind the hanging wolf pelt and pulls out a bundle wrapped in aged linen, stained and knotted with care. The room stiffens. You hear Sven's breath catch, and even Leif's smug half-smile falters. Because what Freydis holds isn't a weapon. It's evidence, or at least something close enough to pass. A bundle of old love notes, penned in Thorbjorn's rough hand, describing the night she was conceived in embarrassing poetic detail. Under the goat moon, your mother was fire and fog, and I was no longer myself. The note is pressed onto birch bark, the ink faded but legible. Her mother had kept them hidden, and Freydis, clever Freydis, had waited until now to use them. And this is where it gets deliciously complicated. Because Viking courts didn't rely on proof the way we think of it today. There were no fingerprints, no DNA tests, no lawyers in robes. Instead, there was reputation, witness oaths, and storytelling that had to sway a crowd of elders drunk on beer and bias. The question wasn't what is true, but what feels most true in this moment. And a love letter, even one scrawled under the influence of pine bark wine and midnight lust, could shift the balance. Historians still argue whether such personal artifacts were admissible in thing assemblies, or if they merely served as emotional leverage to bend decisions in favor of those brave enough to wield them. But if a man's dying affection can be read aloud before a panel of stone-faced neighbors, and it makes someone cry or nod solemnly, then what is that if not a kind of justice? Freydis begins to read one aloud, and the words are clumsy but unmistakably tender. Your eyes were like the northern sea, dark, cold, and full of things I could never understand. There's a snort from the corner. Someone mutters, romantic, for a man who couldn't spell his own name sober. But it doesn't matter. The room is shifting. Freydis has taken the stage, and her story is suddenly the loudest. She's not asking to be believed. She's declaring it. You feel it in your bones, the weight of stories told at the right time, like well-placed stones in a storm-flooded river. They can redirect everything. And now, for tonight's peculiar sexual detour, there's a tale recorded in the margins of an obscure Swedish saga about a woman named Thora who inherited her uncle's farm by invoking a very specific sexual tradition. According to the story, Thora had been born during a wedding feast and conceived during a fertility ritual involving honey, antlers, and an embarrassingly interpretive dance under the moonlight. Her claim? That the ritual counted as a sacred union, witnessed by the gods, and thus her blood was as legitimate as any. The local judge laughed, until Thora, stripped to her shift, revealed the birthmark on her thigh in the shape of Yggdrasil, the Yggdrasilda world tree, and recited a verse that made half the court weep. She won the land, then sold it 2 weeks later to fund a journey to Constantinople, where she allegedly married a Byzantine eunuch who smelled of cloves and betrayal. Its stories like these that make you wonder how many inheritances were won not with weapons, but with whispers, with a flash of skin, a perfectly timed poem, or a scandal recited at just the right pitch. Viking society was steeped in spectacle, and sex wasn't just something you did in secret. It was a tool, a gamble, a kind of social currency that could flip a family's fortunes overnight. You didn't just sleep with someone for love. Sometimes you did it for leverage. Sometimes for safety. Sometimes for a pig and a promise. Which brings us back to the longhouse. As Freydis folds her letters and tucks them beneath her cloak, Inga clears her throat. Everyone turns. And this is where things get weird. Because Inga doesn't speak about her father. She speaks about her mother. About a night when a drunk Thorbjorn came to the servants' quarters, holding a half-carved spoon and mumbling about fate. About how he had asked for warm bread and had gotten something else entirely. About how, afterward, he wept into her mother's lap and told her, "You're the only one who sees me." Inga's voice doesn't tremble. She doesn't ask for pity. She simply says, he knew, maybe no one else did. But he did. And in that moment, the air seems to thicken. Because what she's saying isn't just about inheritance. It's about intimacy. About being seen. You could almost hear the elders weighing her words. Inga has no letters, no rings. But she has a memory that feels too specific to be fiction. And that's how this worked. Viking law, in practice, was often theater performed. Truths, dramatic timing, and the persuasive power of a well-placed tear or perfectly rehearsed silence. It didn't matter if Inga's story was real. It mattered that it landed. That it filled the hall like smoke. Now, before we drift too far. A bit of fringe history to spice your night. In one rare Danish law code from the 10th century, there's mention of a practice called witnessed betting, where a couple's first sexual encounter, if linked to inheritance, had to be seen or at least heard by designated elders. No, really. They didn't watch the whole thing, obviously, but they were expected to hear the betting happen noises, declarations, maybe a thump or two. The goal wasn't voyeurism. It was legal protection. A verbal confirmation of union, a soundtrack. Of legitimacy. Historians still debate how widespread the practice was, but a preserved letter from a disgruntled elder complains of having to spend the coldest night of the year listening to groans and bad poetry through a tent wall. So now in the longhouse we have three claimants. Sven with his title by default. Leif with his ring and whispered memories. Freydis, armed with love letters and ice in her veins. And Inga, standing on the edge of legitimacy, balancing her. Story like a dagger on the tip of a finger. The elders sit in silence, the fire hisses, and you? You sit there too, just a shadow among the firs, listening to the way inheritance hangs not on laws, but on longing. Not on records, but on what people remember when their bellies are full and their hearts feel hollow. This isn't just about property. It's about presence. About who was there when the jarl coughed blood into his beard. Who held his hand when he said he was tired. Who cleaned his chamber pot. Who dared to love him even when he was bitter and old and smelled like bad cheese. And regret. And in that space, in that raw, messy, deeply human corner of memory, inheritance is decided. Not in stone, but in smoke. The wind outside has dropped, replaced by a low fog that creeps along the earth like spilled milk. The longhouse breathes slower now, warm with tension, heavy with memory. But inside that thick, ember-lit air, something. Small, something barely noticed begins to stir a whisper, barely a scratch above the crackle of the hearth. It's coming from the shadows near the servant's bench, where an old woman sits hunched, wrapped in so many shawls she looks more rug than person. Her name is Runa, and no one remembers when she arrived. She might have been there when Bjorn was born. Might have been there when his father was laid in a boat with gold coins over his eyes, and his third wife screaming that it should have been her, not the horse, tied to the prow. Runa clears her throat, and everyone looks at her, half expecting a sneeze or a dying rattle. Instead, she speaks. The girl speaks true. I heard it. He named her. The room tilts. Inga doesn't even blink. Sven leans forward like he's about to lunge, but holds back. You hear the soft intake of breath, the shudder of shifting power. Because Runa wasn't just any servant, she was Bjorn's wet nurse. The one who'd held him to her chest, before he even knew his own name. The woman who could have buried 100 secrets in the folds of her apron, and no one would have dared ask what they were. This is where things get beautifully, fantastically messy. Viking inheritance disputes were not just about wills or warriors. They were often won or lost based on the words of old women who had nothing left to lose. Wet nurses, housekeepers, thralls who had scrubbed floors and overheard too much, all of them repositories of domestic power. And if one of them chose to speak at the right time, their voice could be as sharp as a blade. Historians still argue whether testimony from servants carried legal weight in Viking courts, or if it simply served to tilt public sentiment. But in a culture where oaths mattered more than documents, and truth could be confirmed by swearing on a sacred tree or the bones of your ancestors. An old woman's word could be enough to ruin or restore a name. Runa tells her story slowly, voice cracking like dry branches. She remembers the night clearly, storm outside, fire dim, Bjorn too sick to drink. She brought him broth. He asked for Inga, called her my spark in the dark, said she'd been overlooked. Sighed he should have given her more. He pressed his hand to her hair, Runa says, and said, she is mine. She's the last I'll ever have. Whether he meant daughter or regret, no one can say. But Runa heard it. And in this room, that might just be enough. And now, since it's tradition, let's take a short detour into something sultry and strange. This one comes from The Erotic Spirit Through History, an 8th century tale of a Viking merchant's wife named Sigrid who seduced her brother-in-law to secure her unborn child's inheritance. Her husband was presumed lost at sea, and the local law stated that property could only pass to direct male heirs. So Sigrid made sure to create one, just in case her husband didn't return. The brother-in-law wasn't hard to convince. He was already in love with her, had been since they were teenagers. She invited him over under the pretense of needing help with accounting, which in her household involved more bed sheets than balance sheets. Afterward, she made him swear that the child would be considered his brother's, and she kept the sheets as evidence of fertility. 9 months later, the child was born. The brother-in-law kept his word, and the merchant miraculously alive returned just in time to admire his miracle son. He never questioned it. The sheet was displayed like a relic. The child grew up wealthy, and Sigrid died at 78, still smirking. Back in our longhouse, you can feel the elders weighing every word, every memory. Runa's frail voice still hangs in the rafters like cobwebs. But Sven, ever the strategist, isn't done. He rises, fists clenched, and says what no one dared to say. She's a servant, a liar. She wants something. And it's true. Runa has no family, no land, just her stories. But that doesn't mean they're false. Sven's attack is bold, but risky. Because in challenging Runa, he's not just questioning a woman, he's challenging memory itself. And that's dangerous, because everyone in the room has used memory to shape their own pasts. Freydis watches closely, her expression unreadable. Leif rubs the serpent ring like a lucky coin. Inga steps forward, not to defend Runa, but to tell another story. One no one expected. She tells of a night, years ago, when she was 12, and she saw Sven sneaking into a barn with a girl who later disappeared. She doesn't name the girl, but her meaning is clear. She's not threatening, she's reminding. Because secrets don't just belong to the dead. And sometimes, the price of pushing too hard is having your own skeletons dragged out and paraded before the goats. And this is the heart of Viking inheritance. Not simply who deserved what, but who could stand tallest under the weight of whispered truths. It was theater, yes, but also chess. And some of the best players were the quiet ones. The ones like Inga, who had nothing to lose and everything to remember. Now, here's a quirky tidbit to break the tension. In one rural district of eastern Norway, inheritance claims could be strengthened by performing a truth dance around a hearth barefoot, with a knife balanced on one's head. The dance was meant to prove sincerity, physical poise, and a connection to ancestral fire. A ridiculous spectacle, yes, but taken very seriously. One man slipped during the dance, sliced his ear, and was disqualified. The land went to his cousin, who danced barefoot in the snow and never blinked. Historians still argue whether this ritual was symbolic, religious, or just the community's way of laughing before making serious decisions. But the lesson was clear. Proving truth often required performance, and that's exactly what tonight is. A performance. Each heir stepping forward with props, poetry, promises. Sven with his rage and his title. Leif with his silver snake. Freydis with her stained letters. Inga with her servant's loyalty and her own unshakable voice. Each of them, hoping their truth lands deeper, cuts sharper. Each of them hoping that Thorbjorn's ghost, wherever it lingers, is listening. The embers flicker low. Someone opens a window slit. Cold air snakes in, brushing your skin like an old regret. The dispute isn't over, not yet. But something has shifted. A servant's whisper has become testimony. An illegitimate girl has become a contender. And a legacy once thought simple has cracked open to reveal layers of lust, longing, and lies wrapped in old linen, and sharper still in memory. By now, the longhouse smells like ash and anticipation. The kind of air that makes your nose twitch, like it's holding its breath along with everyone else. A single ember pops in the hearth, tiny and defiant, as if even the fire knows what's coming next. Because now, from the darkest corner, a woman rises. She isn't kin. She isn't even welcome. Her name is Ilsa, and most here would prefer to forget her. She was once Thorbjorn's concubine, his favorite. Some whispered, the woman he took into his bed during his second winter as jarl, after his wife fell ill and before he remembered that politics disapproved. Ilsa was not nobly born. She came from the coast, daughter of a fisherman and a midwife. She had salt water in her blood and wildness in her walk. And Thorbjorn, in one of his more drunken declarations, once told the village that she smelled like the sea and solved all his headaches. A few people laughed at the time. Fewer are laughing now. Because she's holding a small child by the hand, and that child has Thorbjorn's eyes. That unmistakable glacier blue that skips generations and shamus lies. The room cracks wide open. Not with shouting, but with silence. That special kind of Viking silence that means trouble, judgment, and probably a duel if someone doesn't start swearing soon. Ilsa doesn't wait. She speaks clearly, not loudly, and tells them what they already fear. That this child, her son, named Raffin, is Thorbjorn's lastborn. Conceived not by law, not by wedlock, but by routine. A rhythm of warm beds and half-formed promises. He loved me, she says, not with tears, but with fire. Maybe not in daylight, but at night, when the snow curled against the door and he couldn't sleep, he always found me. Now here's the legal twist that pulls your blanket a little tighter. Viking law had a peculiar soft spot for concubines. While Christian scribes like to portray Viking sexuality as wild and godless, the truth was more complicated. Men could have concubines, and often did, particularly chieftains, who needed heirs, alliances, and sometimes just peace at home. A concubine wasn't a wife, but she wasn't nothing either. If a man openly acknowledged a child from such a union, that child could inherit, not always equally, but enough to cause trouble. And that's what Raffin is, trouble in tiny boots. He doesn't speak, but he stares at Sven with a kind of bored curiosity, as if already wondering what his older brother might taste like in a duel. Historians still argue whether concubine children held consistent rights across Viking lands. Icelandic law codes seem to permit some claims. Norwegian customs leaned more patriarchal. But all agree on one thing. If the father declared the child as his own in front of witnesses, even just once, that child could not be erased. And according to Ilsa, Thorbjorn had done just that at the midsummer feast. Too drunk to walk, too stubborn to lie, he stood and slurred, "That boy is mine." Seaborn, storm-strong, better than the lot of you. Some laughed, some ignored it, but others remembered. And those memories now step forward like summoned ghosts. 3 men speak, graybeards with ale bellies and axes they haven't lifted in years. They confirm the claim. They remember the feast, the storm, the swaying torchlight, the way Thorbjorn had slurred the child's name like a toast. Maybe he was drunk, maybe he meant it, maybe both. But that's the point truth in. Viking inheritance wasn't a clean line. It was a mood, a memory, a murmur backed by enough witnesses to make it stick. And now, with 3 voices supporting Ilsa, the mood has changed. But Sven, of course, doesn't go quietly. His voice rises like a bear roar, full of desperation dressed. In dignity, it was ale. He named the goat his heir before dessert. There's laughter, but it's brittle. Even Sven's supporters look uneasy. Because whatever you think of Ilsa, no one doubts her courage. To walk into a room like this, with her child, knowing the wolves were ready, that's not just bravery. That's inheritance warfare. And now, for your evening's sensual absurdity. In one preserved tale from the saga-rich Orkney Islands, a woman named Odd convinced her dying father to legitimize her son by recreating, in detail, the night of the child's conception. That's right. She made him recount the moment aloud, what was said, what was worn, even what food was half-eaten on the table. Her father, amused and nostalgic, described it all in vivid, almost poetic detail. There was salt on her neck from the sea. Her breath smelled of plums. She bit my ear and cursed my name. When he finished, Odd clapped once and said, "Now you've confessed it before gods and men." The room cheered. Her son got the land. The neighbors were mildly traumatized. Laugh, but you also get it. Because the line between performance and truth in Viking inheritance was razor thin. People didn't just argue their claims, they sang them, danced them, seduced them. And sometimes they won because they were simply more memorable than their rivals. Back in the longhouse, Leif looks rattled. Freydis, calculating, Inga, curiously serene. It's as if she's already factored this twist into her plan. Ilsa's entrance doesn't just complicate the game, it exposes the fragility of everyone. Elsa's claims. Because if Bjorn could declare Raffen in a drunken toast, who's to say he didn't whisper a promise to each of them in different moments? Whose memory matters most? And then Runa, still curled in her shawls, chuckles. It's not a happy sound. He was generous with his words. She mutters. Promised the moon to every woman who brought him bread. The line stings. Because that's the truth, isn't it? Bjorn was many things: a warrior, a drunk, a lover, a liar. And now in death, he's all of them at once. And his children must fight not only each other, but his inconsistencies. Sven, realizing he's being outflanked on all sides, tries one last trick. If we believe every whisper and every drunk ramble, then nothing means anything. But even he knows it's weak. Because in this culture, memory is law. And law, at its most brutal, is a story repeated until no one dares contradict it. The fire is low now. Shadows stretch long, fingers across the floor. Outside, the fog thickens. Inside, the lines are redrawn. 4 claimants now. Sven, the legitimate. Son, Leif, the shadow-favored one. Freydis, daughter of passion and parchment. Inga, memory's daughter. And Raffen, sea-born, storm-strong, staring at the fire like he already knows it will someday burn for him. You don't see the axe until it's already been slammed onto the table. Sven's final argument, not spoken, but thunked down in polished steel. The weapon glints under the firelight, its edge freshly whetted, its handle carved with the same curling knotwork that adorns the family shield hung above the hearth. This isn't just a threat, not in the way of sudden violence. No, it's a claim, a reminder. Because this axe was Bjorn's own. Not a ceremonial one, not decorative. This was the blade that split a rival's skull at the border of Uppsala. That was blessed by a wandering seer who spat on the edge and called it truth in metal. It had hung above Bjorn's bed, resting above generations of sighs, quarrels, and dreams. And when he died, Sven took it before the breath had fully left his body. He's betting everything on it now, hoping this steel, this object steeped in blood and legacy, speaks louder than the voices rising around him. He gave me this, Sven says, finally, his voice a slow thunder. He said it would go to the true heir. That's the moment the room shifts from tense to electric. Everyone knew the axe existed, of course, but no one had asked about it. Because in Viking culture, a weapon wasn't just a tool, it was a symbol, a soul. A sword passed down might be worth more than land. An axe like this could crown or curse. And Sven's play is brutal in its simplicity. A physical object. No letters, no whispers, no memories wrapped in lace. Just steel, and the steel, like everything else, is watching. But Leaf, bless his poetry-addled soul, isn't ready to be outdone by a blade. He steps forward, lifts his serpent ring again, and says, "If we're showing tokens, then I'd like to remind the room of this given at midsummer, with a witness and a blessing carved in runes beneath the fire pit." A murmur rises. The elders glance toward the hearth. Indeed, under the soot-blackened stone is a line of runes etched by Bjorn himself. A charm of protection and favor dot, and that's the genius of Viking legal messines. Proof wasn't centralized. It lived in scattered places, beneath stones, in the shape of jewelry, hidden in folded linens or blurted during feasts. There was no archive, no seal of the king to validate a will. There was community, memory, gossip passed through generations, like a family heirloom. And right now, that gossip has turned into ammunition. Freydis, not to be outshined, unfurls a piece of embroidery. It's a wolf, stitched in golden thread, mouth open, tongue trailing fire. "I made this for him," she says softly. "He wore it during the last raid. Said I had the sharpest hands in the house." You can feel the elders react, not with logic, but with something more ancient. Embroidery was sacred in its own right, especially in a man's final years. Not just art, memory, sewn stitch by careful stitch. A reminder of hands that mended, not destroyed. A quiet claim to intimacy. And then comes Inga's move, as unexpected as it is effective. She holds up a bone comb, small, worn. "He gave this to my mother," she says. Said it reminded him of her simple, necessary, and sharp. The room chuckles. Someone coughs to hide a grin. But the comb is real, and you know what? Comb gifts mattered. In Viking romance, to give a comb was to acknowledge beauty and utility. It was a compliment meant to last. A low-born woman given. A comb by a chieftain could point to it for decades as proof of affection, of recognition. There's even a saga where a marriage proposal was sealed with a comb and a piece of smoked eel. The eel didn't last. The comb was buried with the bride. Now, the air is choked with objects. Not just tokens, but evidence. Stories, yes, but ones made tactile. And still, the elders hesitate. Because no matter how many rings, axes, or scraps of love poetry they see, none of it gives a clear answer. Viking law favored oaths sworn. Statements spoken before witnesses, sometimes sealed with sacred gestures. Which brings us to Thor's hammer. A replica of Mjolnir now rests on the table beside the broth bowl, carved from dark wood and used for blessings. And Leaf, ever the dramatist, suggests what everyone dreads. Let each of us swear on the hammer. Swear what we believe. And let the gods judge. This, friends, is where things get spiritual. Because in the absence of legal bureaucracy, the Vikings leaned into divine arbitration. Swearing on Mjolnir wasn't just tradition. It was a covenant with fate. To lie while holding the hammer was said to invite divine retribution sickness. Storms, a mysterious rash in uncomfortable places. And more than one saga records such oaths as binding. Sven scoffs. Fine, but no riddles, no poetry. He grabs the hammer and swears, "I am the rightful heir, by blood, by blade, by my father's will." Short, sharp, brutal. Leaf takes it next, his hand lingering longer, as if the wood might whisper something. "I was his son in truth, if not in law. He chose me, in fire and in fear. I swear it." Freydis follows. "I was born of love. Named In secret, he said I was the fierce one. I believe it. Inga hesitates. Her hand trembles, but her voice doesn't. He called me his spark. I think he meant it. I swear. And finally little Raffin. Ilsa lifts him up, places his small fingers on the hammer, and whispers the words for him. He is my father. I know it. Let the gods remember. The silence afterward is so deep, you hear the wood groan beneath. The longhouse. Now, let's pivot to tonight's sex tale, one that involves not gods but goats. Yes, goats. In a particularly strange folktale from the Faroe Islands, a dispute over a farm inheritance was settled not by oaths, but by whoever could recount in detail the most erotic story involving the dead landowner. A woman named Hild claimed a landowner once wooed her in a goat pen using only a flute and a bowl of fermented milk. She described in poetic detail how the goats danced, how the milk spilled, and how the night ended with the man proposing to her using a goat horn as a ring. The tale was absurd, but oddly convincing. The elders, laughing and blushing, granted her the farm. She never farmed. She opened a storytelling school, which is to say, performance mattered. Emotion mattered. A good story, delivered with conviction, could reshape inheritance. And back in our longhouse, the stories are piling up like driftwood after a storm. But so far, no clear tide, until Runa speaks again. Her voice, though soft, cuts through the air like cold steel. He named none of you in public. Not once. He whispered to each of you in the dark, but he gave nothing in the light. That hits, because if true, it means no one holds the crown. Everyone is an heir, and no one is. It means the land might be split, or worse, seized by the council and redistributed. The room ripples with unease. And still, the axe gleams. The ring glints, the comb lies still. You realize this isn't about inheritance anymore. It's about identity. About each of them needing to be chosen. Not for the land, but for the love. For proof that their father saw them. That they mattered. And now in the firelight, they are each waiting, not for a ruling, but for the weight of memory to tip in their favor. The door bursts open with a gust of wind so cold it feels like the dead jarl himself just walked back in, dragging a blizzard. Behind him, every candle flickers. The flames lean sideways like they're bowing to whatever force just arrived. But it's not a ghost. It's a rider, wet, wild-eyed, and clearly in no mood for small talk. His cloak is torn, his boots crusted with mud, and tucked under his arm clutch like it might fly away if he loosens his grip, is a sealed leather satchel. Your spine tightens, because in Viking inheritance disputes, no news ever arrives dry. The rider doesn't remove his hood. He just drops the satchel on the table and says, "From the bride's kin." And just like that, every face in the room turns not toward him, but toward the one person who's gone quiet since the last oath was sworn, Freydis. Because what most people forgot or ignored is that Freydis' mother wasn't just a healer with nice braids. She was a peace bride. A strategic marriage made not for love, but to end a blood feud with a northern clan. And when Bjorn married her, he didn't just take a wife. He inherited a fragile truce sealed with silver, spit, and 3 barrels of mead. That truce had conditions, and one of them, that any child born of the bride would inherit a portion of land deemed ancestral, to ensure no old grudges reignited. Freydis, it turns out, may be more than a daughter. She may be a living treaty. Satchel creaks as she opens it. Inside, a wax tablet with notched runes and a strip of blood-marked fabric. The runes are plain, blunt, official. A statement from her mother's kin, affirming Freydis' inheritance rights, backed by 3 witnesses and a warning. If our name is betrayed, the sword will return. That line lands hard, because no one here doubts it. The Northern clan is infamous for holding grudges like frost holds branches silent, unrelenting. If Freydis is denied her inheritance, This hall won't be a courtroom anymore. It'll be a battlefield. And here's the twist most didn't see coming. Viking inheritance wasn't just internal. It wasn't just about who lived under the same roof. Marriages were alliances, and alliances came with baggage. Brothers with axes, cousins with longboats, uncles who drank too much and remembered every insult. Property could be political. A bride's children could be insured like cattle. And if those children were denied their rights, you didn't just risk their wrath, you risked war. Historians still argue whether treaties like these had legal teeth or were merely social threats dressed in fancy runework. But in practice, no one wanted to be the fool who called the bluff. Freydis doesn't speak. She just places the tablet beside her embroidery, the threads catching the edge of the candlelight like gold teeth. Sven curses under his breath. Leif looks suddenly uncertain. Even Ilsa tightens her grip on Raffen, because this isn't a memory. This is writing. This is threat. This is power, baked into the oldest rule of Viking survival. Don't mess with someone whose kin can sail in with torches and zero chill. So, naturally, it's the perfect moment for another inheritance horror story. This one comes from the brittle edge of Danish folklore, a tale of a woman named Helga who's married off to settle a livestock dispute. Her dowry included a single pig, 4 crates of dried fish, and a meadow known for its aggressive bees. When her husband died, she claimed the meadow. His sons disagreed. Her revenge? She sent the bees. Literally. She convinced the local beekeeper to transport 5 hives to the son's new field. And within days, one of them swelled up like a cursed turnip. Helga then stood before the elders and read a poem about bee loyalty and divine justice. The court, either terrified or amused, gave her the meadow. She never remarried. Became a local legend. Died with honey in her hair. Back in the longhouse, things are now a full-blown spectacle. The table is littered with symbols, rings, axes, letters, combs, and now an official rune tablet that might start a war if ignored. And yet, for all the noise, no one is ready to make a final call. The elders whisper, the fire sputters. Even the dog under the bench whines like it knows a storm's coming. And that's when Leif, once again, reaches for theater. He rises, lifts his serpent ring and says, "We've spoken of blood, of objects, of whispers and oaths. But what about intention?" The room tilts toward him. What if inheritance isn't about what was said in a drunken haze or carved into birch, but about what was meant? And now we're in dangerous territory. Because intent, in Viking law, was both everything and nothing. It was the soul of the claim, but almost impossible to prove. Unless, of course, someone else heard it. And wouldn't you know, Leif claims someone did. A sireman. A wandering sorcerer who once stayed in the longhouse during a winter storm and spoke with Thorbjorn for 3 nights straight. Leif claims the man heard Thorbjorn mutter his true feelings about each child, especially the one he called the Quiet Fire. Leif says he was that fire. That the sorcerer told him he had the jarl's soul, just wrapped in silence. Cue the groans. Even Runa raises an eyebrow, but no one entirely laughs. Because siremen, for all their oddness, carried weight. Especially if they weren't local. Outsiders had less reason to lie. And Viking spirituality wasn't squeamish visions, dreams, omens, and animal bones. They all had a seat at the table. Some sagas describe inheritance dreams as binding if shared aloud. Others tell of ravens choosing heirs by whose shoulder they perched on. The supernatural wasn't above the law, it was tangled in it. And to keep tonight's rhythm, here's your dose of erotic entanglement. A tale from the Laxdæla saga tells of a woman named Gudrun, who used dream divination to determine which of her lovers would die first, and thus which would leave her the most favorable inheritance. She seduced 4 brothers over 2 winters, buried tokens of each under her bed, then had a dream where she saw 3 boats sink and 1 drift ashore. She married the survivor. The others did indeed die too by duel, one by sheep-related accident. Gudrun inherited enough land to build a bathhouse and became the first woman in her region to charge admission. Her rates were considered steep, but the water was always warm. Back in the longhouse, Leif's tale of the sorcerer doesn't win the room, but it doesn't lose it either. Because in a sea of chaos, sometimes the softest lies feel safest. Still, the elders don't move. The decision won't be made tonight, not while the wind still howls. Not while each child still has more to reveal. But what Freydis has done is unmistakable. She has shifted the ground. This isn't just a family squabble now. It's a political earthquake waiting for a trigger. And you, sitting among it all, feel the weight of Viking inheritance like a stone in your gut. It's not about wealth. It's about who gets remembered. Who gets to keep their story told in feasts, in sagas, in quiet lullabies before the snow comes again. And tonight, in the glow of a dying fire, 5 stories are still fighting to be. Soon, the hearth has burned down to coals now, the glow pulsing like the breath of some ancient creature sleeping just beneath the floor. And above it, a silence thicker than snow sits over the longhouse. It's not peace. No, nothing about this night smells like peace. It smells like wool and sweat and decisions that haven't been made. You lean forward, and even the elders seem to shrink into their furs, bracing for what comes next. Because in this moment, someone has just spoken a word that turns stomachs and summons spirits. The word is virginity. And it's Freydis who says it, cool as a fjord breeze. She doesn't say it like a question. She says it like a knife. You want to know what mattered most to him? She says. He used to say the only truth you could prove was blood. And the only way to know blood was to know if a woman bled. There it is. A statement as old as the pine trees that creak. Outside, the ancient, tangled belief that a woman's worth and her children's status could be measured in a single night and a single stain. You can feel the ripple go through the hall like a rope being pulled tight. Because while it's one thing to argue over rings and axes, it's another thing entirely to argue about bedsheets. And Freydis, as always, has come prepared. She pulls from a wooden chest a folded scrap of linen aged, yellowed, but still visibly stained with something that could be blood, or maybe just the iron of time. He kept this, she says, tucked beneath his cloak chest. Proof, evidence, maybe even a reminder. Some gasp, others scoff. But no one can look away. Now here's the bitter truth. In some Viking communities, a woman's virginity wasn't just a social contract. It was a legal tool. Wedding nights were sometimes witnessed indirectly, through sheets or servant testimony. And those who could produce blood-stained linens were granted a stronger claim for their children. It was symbolic, yes, but also terrifyingly literal. Historians still argue whether this custom was widespread or regional, whether it protected women or trapped them. But in court cases, real or imagined virginity often turned the tide. Freydis offers the linen not as a plea, but as proof that her mother came into Thorbjorn's life, not just loved, but clean. That Freydis wasn't just a daughter, she was the product of a legitimate, if inconvenient, union. He could have thrown this away, she says, but he didn't. And the linen lies there, ghost white and humming with implication. Let's drift now, gently, into an appropriate erotic anecdote. A 10th century tale from Sweden tells of a woman named Rania, who ensured her son's legitimacy by faking her virginity twice. The first time, she used sheep's blood on the wedding sheets, presented the proof with ceremony, and sang a hymn to Freya. Years later, when her husband died and her inheritance was questioned, she claimed her second son had also been conceived under sacred purity. This time, she bribed a servant to testify to the cries heard from the wedding tent cries. It was said, louder than battle and twice as passionate. Her sons inherited everything. Rania retired to a farm known for its unusually docile rams. Make of that what you will. Back to Frades. Her play is risky, but she knows what she's doing. Because the more physical the evidence, the harder it is to ignore. She isn't just invoking tradition, she's weaponizing it. And though some scoff, others shift uncomfortably. The elders glance at each other. One murmurs, "A man doesn't keep cloth unless it meant something." Sven, of course, isn't done. He lunges at the argument from the side, not denying the linen, but belittling it. So what? She bled. That proves nothing about inheritance. And here we see his mistake. Because he's stepping into a trap Frades set before she even opened the chest. She replies, cool as melting snow. It proves he believed it. And that's all that matters. And she's right. In Viking logic, belief shaped legacy. If Bjorn thought she was his legitimate heir, if he preserved proof of her mother's virtue, then it doesn't matter what the law says. The law is only ever half muscle, half myth. Inga watches this unfold with that calm she wears like armor. She doesn't argue, she doesn't mock. She simply pulls from her satchel a folded shirt, Bjorn's, threadbare at the sleeves. "He gave this to me when I was 12, she says. "Told me to wear it when I was afraid." The room tilts. Again, this isn't legal proof, it's emotional artillery. And it hits. You start to notice something subtle now. The shift from legality to legacy. The heirs aren't just fighting over cows and fields. They're fighting over who was loved most, who was seen, who was chosen. And that, perhaps, is the cruelest trick of inheritance, not what's left behind, but who gets to say they were held first. A fringe ritual pops into your mind, a tidbit passed down from the pharaohs. In some fishing villages, the inheritance of nets and boats went not to sons, but to the child who could recall the most lullabies sung by the dead. It wasn't about wealth, it was about memory. Emotional inheritance. The kind that doesn't rust or rot. Back in the room, Leaf tries again. Maybe we're all his children, he says. Maybe he loved each of us differently. Noble, sure, but ineffective. Because love, in this context, is not a blanket. It's a blade. And whoever wields it best will walk away with more than property. They'll walk away with history. And now, for your obligatory erotic sidebar, the Kama Sutra. Yes, the ancient Indian text which made its way to some parts of the Norse world. Via trade routes includes a section on the politics of pleasure. It describes how rulers used sexual favors as legal favors, how certain women could secure land through excellence in the arts of touch. One Viking woman, traveling with traders down the Volga, was known to carry a copy. She allegedly taught a local chief's wife 3 techniques of seduction, then convinced the woman to name her as co-inheritor of a jewelry hoard. The document is gone. The legend remains. Back again to the fire. The objects have spoken. The linens, the shirts, combs, the axes. The room is full of ghosts now, whispering behind the ears of the living. And you, sitting amid them, realize that inheritance is never about clarity. It's about control. About shaping the past into a story that favors your name. Frades leans back. Inga stares into the coals. Leif clutches his ring. Sven's fists are bloodless. And outside, beyond the walls, snow begins to fall. Slowly, softly, like ash from a fire that no one quite managed to put out. Somewhere in the darkness outside, a raven croaks, just once. Harsh, short, and perfectly timed like the punchline. To a cosmic joke no one in the longhouse is ready to laugh at. You glance toward the roof beams, half expecting to see feathers drift down into the firelight. But there's only shadow. Inside, the silence is now sacred, the kind that settles like dust on every surface, thin but impossible to ignore. And in that breathless hush, something shifts, not in the room, but in the air itself. Because the next person to speak isn't Sven, or Frades, or even Runa. It's a stranger. A figure draped in mismatched wool, barefoot despite the cold, with hands that twitch like spider legs. He's been sitting in the corner since nightfall, barely noticed. Most thought he was just another elder, some distant cousin called in to listen and drink and say nothing. But now he rises, slowly, like a tree deciding to move. I was there the night he bled, the man says, voice as dry as old parchment. I was the one who wrapped his wound after the boar gored him. Number 1 interrupts. You don't interrupt a man who talks about blood with that kind of calm. He told me something strange. He said, if I die now, tell them I've already chosen. I asked him what he meant. He just laughed, said the gods had made it clear. This is where it gets weird, because the man doesn't produce a will. He doesn't offer an object, a rune, a comb, or a curse. What he offers is a vision. He said Odin sent him a dream. A black horse, 5 heads, 5 mouths, and only one drinking from the stream. The man stares at the fire. He said the horse with the crooked ear drank first. The rest bit at the water, but none tasted it. Leaf blinks. His left ear is slightly twisted, scarred in childhood, a dog bite, a long-forgotten story suddenly dragged into prophecy. The room tilts. No one speaks. Because in Viking culture, dreams weren't metaphor, they were messages. Odin himself was said to whisper secrets into men's sleep, and to ignore a vision was to court ruin. Historians still debate whether these dream testimonies had legal weight. But socially, absolutely. People took dreams seriously. If a respected elder claimed to have heard a dying man's vision, and that vision seemed to align with something physical like a scar, a birthmark, or even the way a person walked, that could sway an entire thing assembly. Dreams weren't just dreams. They were verdicts waiting for interpretation. Leaf doesn't react. He doesn't have to. Everyone is already doing the math. The crooked ear, the vision, the timing, whether true or not, it feels real. And that's what makes it dangerous. Of course, there's another layer. A layer that makes this whole thing deliciously uncomfortable. The man, who now gives his name Otter, was once known in the coastal villages as a sireman, a practitioner of seer magic, a man who, in youth, wore women's clothing during rituals, danced barefoot on stones warmed by goat fat, and claimed he could see the threads of fate. The villagers had mixed feelings about him. Some feared him. Some mocked him. But many came to him in secret, especially women, especially those who needed to be heard, when no one else was listening. And that's the piece no one says out loud. That seer was considered shameful for men because it was unmanly. It required submission, channeling, touching the world of spirits. Odin himself practiced it, but he was Odin. For mortal men, it was seen as effeminate, subversive, which is why Audra's presence here tonight is more than just spooky. It's revolutionary. Let's pause for something sweet and scandalous. A passage from Peter Webb's The Erotic Spirit Through History, describing a 9th century case in which a sireman fathered a child with a chieftain's wife. The woman claimed the man gave her visions of her unborn child's future, and that during the ritual, an ecstatic trance under the full moon, she was overcome with lust and laid with him as though he were the river and I the earth. Her husband, upon hearing the child's prophecy and seeing the resemblance, accepted the child as heir. Not because he believed the story, but because the neighbors did. Back to Audra. He finishes his tale, then sits, folding his cloak around him like fog, no flourish, no plea. Just a story left hanging like meat from a winter rack. And now Leaf is no longer the quiet one. He's the mythical one, the chosen, or at least the most interesting. And in this hall, that might be enough. Sven tries to speak, but his voice breaks. His power, so tied to logic and law, is slipping. Freydis, to her credit, doesn't sneer. She just studies Leaf like she's seeing him for the first time. And Inga? She looks almost relieved. Like if someone else takes the crown, she'll be free to leave this whole frozen mess behind. Ilsa, however, isn't done. Visions are dreams. But blood is blood. And with that, she produces a tiny carved token, an amulet Thorbjorn gave her, the night Raffen was conceived. It's shaped like a fish, rough but carefully detailed. A symbol of protection, fertility, and favor. He gave this to me before he laid with me. Said it would protect our son. And now the fire is a stage again, because each child here has a piece, a relic, a dream, a stain, a token, each one a verse in a saga still being written. And the audience, the elders, the kin, the servants, in the shadows must decide which song to sing. That final strange tidbit of the night. In some remote northern villages, it was said that the gods would favor whichever heir could endure the cold longest. They'd sit outside, barefoot, with only a wool cloak, and whoever lasted until sunrise was seen as chosen. One year, 2 rival sisters participated. One fell asleep after 3 hours. The other bit off part of her own toe to stay awake. She won. She walked with a limp for the rest of her life, but was forever called the Frost Daughter. Her farm thrived. Her enemies never dared challenge her. Inside this longhouse, no one's biting off toes yet. But the emotional temperature is just as brutal. Because now the question is not just who deserves the inheritance, but whose story will be remembered. And that, more than wealth, more than land, is the real prize. To be remembered. To be carved into memory like runes into stone. The coals are dying, the wind has stilled. But inside, hearts pound like war drums muffled beneath fur. The dispute is no longer about property. It's become prophecy. And Leaf, with his scarred ear and ring of silver, now walks the fine line between bastard and myth. It starts with the sound of shifting stone, one of the elders rising from his seat. Bones crackling louder than the fire, face carved with decades of neutrality he's about to abandon. His name is Torvi. He's the oldest in the room, maybe the whole valley, and the only person here who knew Thorbjorn before he was Thorbjorn. The man, not the jarl, not the legend. Back when he was just a wiry boy chasing frogs with a wooden spear and asking too many questions about why women cried when the boats left. Torvi speaks slowly, voice low, but his words hit like war hammers. Thorbjorn never wanted a legacy, he says. He wanted a story, and he made one out of each of you. There it is. The line that cuts deeper than any axe. Because suddenly, it's not about ownership anymore, it's about authorship. Who gets to finish the tale that Thorbjorn started? Who gets to name the ending? Freydis clenches her jaw. Leaf's eyes flicker. Sven opens his mouth, then closes it again. And little Raffen, oblivious to the storm around him, hums softly as he tugs at his mother's sleeve. Torvi goes on. You want to know who the rightful heir is? It's not the one with the axe, or the ring, or the dream. It's the one who lives this story best. It's a brutal truth, but an honest one. Because Viking inheritance wasn't just a list of assets, it was a continuation. The new heir had to carry the name, the weight, the myth. And if they couldn't hold that weight, if they cracked under it, the legacy would crumble, no matter what was written in runes. Historians still argue whether sagas were shaped by the deeds of heirs, or if heirs were shaped by the sagas they were expected to fulfill. But what's certain is this: when the gods looked down, they didn't count sheep or silver. They watched for fire. And so, in this room of tokens and tensions, the battle shifts again. From the past to the future. From proof to performance. Who can be Thorbjorn's heir, not just claim the right? Leaf steps forward. Not because he's ready, but because he has no choice. If legacy is story, he says, then let me speak mine. The elders nod. This is the test. Not of blood, but of tongue. And Leaf begins. He tells of Thorbjorn's last raid, how he wasn't supposed to go, how he hid his fever and boarded the boat anyway, how he coughed blood into the sea and still raised his axe when the Irish merchant screamed. He tells of the night Bjorn held his hand over a fire just to prove a point to a drunk Swedish envoy. He tells of the jarl's fury, but also his fears. How he once said he envied thralls because at least no one expects them to be gods. Leif's voice breaks, but he doesn't stop. And when he finishes, no one claps. They don't have to. The silence is loud enough. Then it's Freydis's turn. She doesn't tell a tale. She sings. A lullaby their mother used to hum while mixing herbs. The words are soft, sharp, all edges and echoes. The room leans into her voice like flowers toward the sun. And when she stops, it feels like a spell has broken. Someone exhales long and slow. Sven follows, but it's not a story he tells. It's a memory, raw, unfiltered. I was the one who burned his cloak, he says. He caught me sneaking out. Sighed I couldn't wear his strength until I earned it. So I threw it in the fire. No one expected that. Least of all Sven himself. He beat me after, not with fists, with silence. Didn't speak to me for a month. The confession lands like thunder. Because it's not about pride, it's about pain. And in this house, pain is currency. Inga's voice is next. He once told me I reminded him of a fox, she says. Too quiet to trust. Too clever to ignore. And that's all she says. But it's enough. Because the room knows. They've seen that fox stare, that stillness, that danger wrapped in calm. Even Ilsa from the shadows speaks. He sang to raft when no one else was watching. A song about ships that never returned. And you realize now what this is. A ritual. Not one written in any law code, but older than that. A reckoning of memory. A summoning of ghosts. Now, let's listen tonight's sensual tale, a saga fragment from Greenland. A woman named Arnia, facing the loss of her lands to a male cousin, challenged him not to combat, but to the telling. A ritual duel of memory and intimacy. They each recounted moments they'd shared with their shared uncle, the man whose property was in dispute. Arnia's cousin spoke of hunts, of wounds, of shared ale. Arnia told of one winter night when the uncle, sick with fever, called her his snow daughter, and how she fed him broth by hand, wept into his chest, and buried his knife with rosemary. The elders wept. The cousin yielded. She kept the land, and that's what this room is. Now a stage. A test. A fire-lit performance where whoever holds the audience holds the future. Not because the past can be proven, but because the future demands a narrator. And here's your oddity for the evening. In parts of the Hebrides, it was believed that whoever could describe a dead man's dreams was his true heir. Dream-telling became a rite performed in song. Or riddle. One man won his inheritance by describing a dream of salmon leaping over a burning fjord. Something the dead man had whispered only once after too much cider. The dream became law. Back in the longhouse, Tarvi speaks again. You've all told your truths, he says. But now the land waits, the name waits, the fire waits, and so do we. The elders will not decide tonight. They need more. Not facts, not tokens. They need to see what comes next. How each claimant holds their place. How each story unfolds. Because inheritance is not given in a moment. It's grown in the days that follow. The fire spits once more, a spark rising into the dark, like a soul with unfinished business. And as it fades, you realize no one here has won. Not yet. The battle for legacy continues, not with swords, but with stories. And stories, as you well know by now, are the sharpest weapons of all. The torch by the door flickers, then dies. Not from wind, but from something heavier, denser. A presence. You don't see it, not directly, but you feel it all the same. The way your skin tightens at the back of your neck when someone's watching. Something ancient just walked into the room, and it didn't bother with knocking. A shadow falls across the wall, not human, not solid, but unmistakably there. And just as suddenly, it's gone. But everyone has seen it. Or felt it. Because that's the thing about Viking ghosts. They don't need faces. They only need memory. And tonight, memory is very much awake. The temperature in the longhouse drops. Not enough for breath to fog, but enough that the oldest elder pulls his cloak tighter, and one of the dogs whines, low and nervous. Frady stands up, her hands still stained from the ink she used to mark the linen letters earlier. She doesn't look frightened. She looks amused. He's listening, she says, voice flat. He always said he would. And this is the part they don't tell you in sagas. When a Viking jarl dies and the inheritance is unclear, the dead don't always stay quiet, especially if they were indecisive or angry, or too proud to let others clean up their mess. Historians are still divided. Some say hauntings were folk embellishment. Others insist that accounts of ghosts appearing during inheritance feuds are too numerous, too eerily consistent to dismiss. Whatever the case, Viking belief held that a restless spirit could influence legal disputes. If a family line was about to be broken, the dead would make their opinion known through dreams, signs, animals behaving strangely, or sudden illness among the disputants. And sometimes, just sometimes, through direct visitation. Tonight, it's a raven, or at least, that's what lands on the roof with such force that the whole room seems to shake. A single loud thunk, followed by the scratch of talons against thatch. The room freezes. Runa crosses herself, not a Christian cross, but a motion more primal, older. Sven mutters a curse. Leif raises his head. He kept ravens, he says. Softly, named them after moods, hunger, doubt, pride. And then, almost to himself, he adds, he always said pride bit hardest. The silence that follows isn't empty, it's expectant. You know the feeling, like when someone holds their breath too long and everyone else starts doing it too. Then, with perfect timing, Inga speaks, not loudly, just clearly. There's something I haven't said. Heads turn, she steps forward, pulls a single object from her satchel. A braided lock of hair, pale brown, tied with black thread. My mother cut this the night she conceived me. So, and she wanted something to prove the moment happened. Just in case he forgot, she pauses. He didn't, he kept it. I found it in his cloak. The simplicity of it is disarming. No runes, no silver, just a lock of hair. But in Viking tradition, hair was sacred. Cutting it marked transformation, passage, covenant. And keeping a woman's braid was intimate, deeper than jewelry, closer than names. Even Odin was said to have gifted a lock of his lover's hair to seal a promise. Some sagas describe locks of hair used as tokens in inheritance rituals, hidden in walls, pressed between pages, even buried in thresholds to bless a new heir's home. Inga doesn't embellish, doesn't explain, just lays it down and steps back. And somehow that restraint makes her claim stronger. Because she's not trying to sell a story, she's presenting a truth and letting it stand on its own crooked legs. And just when you think the emotional gut punches are done, Ilsa steps forward with Raffen, and in a move no one expected, she kneels. Yes, kneels. Not in surrender, but in declaration. He was born under storm clouds, she says, and his father held him to the sky and said, "You'll never fear thunder, because you were born in it." Raffen doesn't react, just stares at the fire with those Thorbjorn eyes blue, and blank and dangerous, and something shifts again. Not legally, but symbolically. Because for all the objects and oaths tossed into this hall tonight, it's still the stories that cut deepest. And speaking of cutting deep, here's your sensual sidebar for the evening. One of Elena Herman's more provocative stories tells of a Frankish noblewoman who secured her inheritance by sleeping with not one, but 3 rival claimants, each in the same week, each swearing she loved only them, and each given a separate letter she claimed was from their mutual uncle. When the will was finally opened and declared void due to ambiguity, the 3 men refused to fight each other, because they were all still hoping to win her. In the end, she took all 3 letters, used them to claim neutrality, and became the guardian of the estate. She later married a bishop and invented a board game involving lies. Back to the Longhouse, where the elders are now visibly struggling. They've heard too much, seen too much. It's no longer a case of yes or no. It's which storm they want to weather. Give Sven everything, and you risk violence. Give Leif the legacy, and you inherit dreams. Give Freydis the name, and you inherit war. Give Inga the house, and you reward memory. Give Raffen the title, and you bet everything on the future. So what do? They stall. One elder stands and calls for a pause of gods, a sacred rest to allow omens to appear. During this pause, no decisions are made. No arguments allowed. Just silence, watching, waiting, listening for the will of the unseen. And that silence settles like a wool blanket soaked in fear. Now your quirky fact for the hour. In one obscure northern province, it was believed that if a cat slept beside the disputed heir, the decision was blessed by the gods. If the cat hissed, the heir was false. This led to an awkward incident where 2 cousins fought over a blind cat's affection for 3 days, bribing it with fish until the animal chose a third party, entirely a servant girl, who later became their stepmother. True story. Probably. Back inside the hall, the fire fades to glowing embers again, and no one speaks. They're all listening now, not to each other, but to the dead. To the raven still perched overhead. To the silence between heartbeats. To the breath of the long-dead jarl who may, even now, be choosing which of his children will carry his story forward. Not with justice, but with resonance. Because in the end, Viking inheritance isn't about law. It's about what lasts. And tonight, what's lasting is not who shouted loudest, or who claimed the sharpest axe. It's who whispered the truth in the softest voice, and was still heard. The embers don't crackle anymore. They glow, pulse, breathe. The Longhouse is still deep in the pause, that sacred hush meant to let the gods weigh in while the mortals stew in their uncertainty. It's a ritual older than the roof, and older, perhaps, than the words spoken under it. But of course, the gods don't always send dreams or ravens. Sometimes they send a thrall. The back door creaks open, not dramatically, not like fate just flung it wide, but with a quiet hesitance, the kind of movement made by someone used to not being noticed. And in walks him, Einar, thin, barefoot, sleeves too short, his face half hidden. Behind a mop of hair and soot, his hands trembling as he carries something wrapped in coarse linen. Everyone turns, though no one rises, because thralls and enslaved servants weren't supposed to speak in these matters. They cleaned up after the inheritance. They didn't shape it. But Einar walks slowly to the center of the room, avoiding everyone's eyes except one. Leif's. And here, dear listener, is where the rules shatter completely. Because what Einar unwraps is not a weapon, not a ring, not even a love letter. It's a bowl, small, carved from bone, stained dark along the inner rim, and etched into its side, nearly faded, is a series of runes that spell out the most dangerous thing a servant can carry, a confession. He made me write it, Einar says, voice so quiet the room leans in to catch it. He couldn't use the knife anymore. His hands shook too much. You hear the intake of breath, sharp and collective. He dictated it, Einar continues. One night, when everyone thought he was asleep, said he didn't trust the kin. Said if he died before finishing, I should burn it. But I couldn't. The bowl is passed to the elders. They read the runes aloud. Thorbjorn's voice, transcribed in trembling syllables. Of all the blood I've spilled and all the lies I've loved, only one child ever listened. Leif. He's my legacy, not because he is lawful, but because he is true. The room exhales. Not relief, shock, grief, anger. A dozen conflicting storms in a single breath. Because this isn't just a statement, it's a final strike. One that cuts through ritual, tradition, and technicality. A confession left in the hands of a thrall. Let's pause to appreciate the audacity. In Viking law, thralls couldn't testify, not officially. Their words were worth less than a goat's fart in court. But outside court, in the messines of family, power, and story, sometimes their words burned hotter than any torch. Historians still argue whether written confessions carried by servants had any recognized legal power. But in practice, the power often came from the silence that followed. Because if no one dares dispute it, if everyone knows, it sounds like something the dead would say. Then it becomes the truth by sheer force of belief. And here's where it gets messy. Leaf doesn't gloat. He doesn't weep. He doesn't even move. He just stares at Einar like someone who's hearing a ghost recite his dreams out loud. The bowl now sits at the center of the table. Freydis is the first to speak. He called me the fierce one, she says, but never the true one. Her voice isn't angry. It's tired. Like she's finally seeing the end of something she didn't want to finish. Sven, meanwhile, is pale. Not with fear, but with insult. To be passed over not by a better warrior, but by the quiet son, the one who wrote poems to trees. It's an injury no blade could inflict. Now, time for tonight's historical entanglement. A French chronicler tells of a Viking chieftain who fathered two sons, one legitimate, one by a serving girl. The girl's son, Brynjar, was taught to read and write by monks during a raid-turned-hostage exchange. On the chieftain's deathbed, he whispered a message, which Brynjar recorded in a wax tablet. The legitimate son challenged it, claiming no boy raised by priests could hold his father's will. But when the village priest stood and read, the tablet filled with foul jokes, battle dates, and pet names only the chieftain used, no one doubted its source. Brynjar inherited the estate. The legitimate son inherited a mule and a bitter nickname, the half-blood brother. Back in the longhouse, Einar doesn't sit. He just bows slightly and walks back into the shadows. No one stops him. No one thanks him. But everyone knows this night won't be remembered for the oaths or the relics. It'll be remembered for the bowl. Freddie stands and moves toward the door, not in defeat, but in decision. She looks back only once. If you carry the story, Leaf, she says, don't let it rot in your mouth. Then she's gone. Inga stays seated, watching, not mourning, calculating. Her game may not be over. Not yet. Ilsa lifts Raffen and kisses his forehead. She doesn't argue, doesn't scream, just holds him tighter. Because even if he's not the heir, he's still a son. And sons, in the end, outlive legacies. Leaf finally steps forward. Takes the bowl, holds it like a crown made of bone and regret. Then let it be me, he says. Not because I'm chosen, but because I'm still listening. It's not a proclamation. It's a promise, and it lands. The elders don't even vote, they nod. That's enough. And for your final curious fact, in some Icelandic families, the heir was decided by drawing lots, literal carved sticks. The logic was that the gods would guide the outcome, and that any man strong enough to lead should also be strong enough to accept fate. It worked until one clan cheated by carving a hollow stick and inserting the winning name. The scandal ended with 3 dead, 1 exiled, and a goat promoted to sacred status. Yes, a goat. And now the fire is just smoke. The longhouse begins to empty, not with joy, not with closure, but with the kind of heavy silence that follows any good story. The kind that leaves everyone a little haunted. And you? You're still here, still listening. Still wondering which version of the truth will be retold when the snow melts and the next feast is held. But for now, Leaf has the bowl. And in this world, that's enough to carry the weight of a name. Outside, the snow begins to fall again, not like a storm, not yet, but soft, steady. The way time slips past unnoticed until it buries everything. And inside the longhouse, even though most have gone to their bedrolls or slipped into the night with excuses and old bones, the air doesn't loosen. It just coils, tighter, because while Leaf may hold the bowl, and the elders may have nodded, not everyone is done with the story. Especially not the Gogi. You notice him now tucked into the corner beside the mead barrel, his priest's robes damp from melted snow, eyes like burnt coals smoldering in his sunken skull. His name is Stenver. He's the one who blesses marriages, judges disputes, leads the winter rites. And he hasn't spoken all night. But now he does, and the sound of his voice is enough to make the dog whimper again. The bowl speaks of truth, he says slowly, but truth without witness is a rumor wrapped in poetry. He stands, brittle but upright, and walks toward the hearth like he owns the fire. Maybe he does, maybe they all do. Did Bjorn write it? Maybe. Or maybe the boy learned his father's hand well enough to fool a grieving thrall. Leaf stiffens. The air thickens. You smell something sharp old ash or scorched pride. I don't say this to challenge your claim, Stenver says, but to remind you, the gods don't care about bowls. They care about courage. The room leans in. Because Stenver doesn't accuse without a purpose. He offers trials. Not always of strength. Sometimes of endurance. Sometimes of shame. And tonight he proposes one more test. A memory oath. An old rite nearly forgotten in these parts, but once standard in Highland courts. The chosen heir must repeat aloud 3. Private memories of the dead, memories not publicly known, ones that cannot be guessed. If the details ring true to those who knew the man, the claim is sealed. If not, the gods are displeased. Leaf doesn't flinch. He nods. I will speak them. The first comes quickly. He once told me he hated boats, Leaf says. Sighed. He never trusted the sea. Said he only sailed because men expect gods to walk on water. There's a murmur. One elder nods. Another chuckles. The second memory. He broke his favorite knife carving a comb for Runa. Didn't tell her. Just gave it to her and lied that it was the wind that cracked the blade. Runa's eyes widen and she lifts a hand to her hair. Slowly, she pulls out the comb. Broken. At the base. She never knew. And the third? Leaf hesitates. Then, he said he wanted to die under a tree, not on a bed. Said beds made him feel like he was being buried before the gods were ready. Stenver stares at him, then says, he told me that too. But he said it like a joke. Leaf just nods. It wasn't. The silence that follows is not just confirmation. It's coronation, not loud. Not official, but complete. But before the crowd can exhale, before closure can start to sprout, someone else stands. Not to challenge, to confess. It's a woman, elderly, dressed in wool dyed with onion skins, lips pursed, hands shaking from something that isn't age. Her name is Brindis. She once served as a midwife. And what she says now unravels the comfort you just wrapped yourself in like a warm pelt. Bjorn had another son, she says. Not in this hall. Not in this valley. Every breath in the room dies. He was born during a raid in the east. His mother died. The child was left in my care. I was told to say it died too. Historians still argue whether midwives were often made accomplices to inheritance suppression. But plenty of saga evidence suggests they held more power than acknowledged. Especially when a child's existence threatened delicate balances of power, marriage, or land. And Brindis, clearly burdened, has held this story for decades. He was named Asketil, she says. Raised by monks, strong, quiet, a smith now, they say. Living far away, he may not even know. And here's the question no one dares ask. Does he have a stronger claim than Leaf? Would Bjorn have preferred him? Did he forget him or remember him too much? Freydis is the first to speak again. Then let him come find the legacy if he wants it, she says. Until then, it's Leif's, a bold statement. But fair, because Viking law, while brutal, was also pragmatic. You couldn't inherit what you didn't claim. And if Asketil doesn't come forward, doesn't tell his story, doesn't step into the firelight, he remains a shadow dot now for your juicy historical side dish. One saga tells of a runaway monk named Ketil who returned to his homeland after 20 years abroad. When his father died, Ketil presented a single item, a sock. Yes, a sock, knitted in a unique pattern known only to his mother. When shown to the family matriarch, she wept and confirmed his identity. He then fought a duel with his half-brother for the inheritance lost, but was gifted a herd of sheep and 3 loaves of rye bread as compensation. He later married a baker's daughter and invented honey-stuffed buns, which became famous across the fjords. Sometimes, legacy is sweet in unexpected ways. Back in the hall, Leif finally speaks. If he comes, he says, I will greet him, but I won't hand over the bowl. And there's a weight in those words. Not defensiveness, resolve, the kind of resolve that comes not from being certain, but from being tired of hiding. The fire is now no more than memory. The room is dim, lit only by the faint glow of breath and belief. Outside, the snow deepens. Inside, the legacy stands not in scrolls, not in law, but in a young man holding a bone bow, wearing the silence like armor, and knowing that the story has not ended. It's only paused, waiting for the next voice to shape it. There's a saying whispered in the back corners of longhouses and sheep barns, the kind of thing no one admits believing until it comes true. If a raven circles a house 3 times after sunset, someone inside is lying. No one remembers where the saying came from, but tonight, someone mutters it under their breath, just as the 3rd croak echoes from above, and everyone's eyes lift toward the rafters like they've suddenly grown heavier. You don't hear the wings, you feel them. The wind doesn't howl. It pulses, and now the room doesn't just feel cold. It feels watched. The fire has long gone out, replaced by the kind of silence that waits to pounce. Leif stands at the center still, the bowl of bone cradled in both hands like it might melt if he loosened his grip. But his gaze isn't on the elders anymore. It's fixed on the figure moving from the back wall, slow and sure-footed, wrapped in a gray cloak that's older than most of the beams overhead. It's Stenver again, the Gogi, the priest judge. The old man who speaks for the gods when they're too busy or too cruel to speak for themselves. And what he says now is less proclamation than diagnosis. The inheritance is not finished, he says. The name has been passed, but the land remembers another. Nobody breathes. Not even you. Stenver gestures toward the door, and everyone turns just in time to see her arrive, a woman. No one expected a woman. Not now, not at this hour. But she walks in like the snow brought her, like she followed the raven's shadow all the way from the coast. Her hair is white not with age, but with ash, like it's been dusted with the memory of fires. Her name is Vala, and she says it before anyone can ask. I am the sister, she says, born to his second wife, the one he never named in. This house, it's not unusual for children born to wives in distant holdings to be forgotten by law, by memory, even by song. But Vala isn't forgotten, not entirely. Runa's face stiffens. Stenver sighs. A few elders look like they've just swallowed hot stones. She was sent away before the frost came, Runa says. The mother died in childbirth. The jarl said the girl was unlucky. Unlucky. The word lands like a blade. Because in Viking culture, luck wasn't just chance. It was blood, spirit, worth. If a child was deemed unlucky, they could be cast out, fed, clothed, even educated, but never named in the legacy. And Vala, she's back, not as a ghost. As a claimant, she steps forward and pulls something from her pouch, a ring. Not silver, iron, shaped crudely, forged fast, but etched with a familiar mark. Thorbjorn's hunting symbol, a half-moon over a wolf's paw. He gave me this the last time I saw him, she says. Said if I ever wanted to belong, I have to bring proof I could survive without him. She survived. Clearly, the elders look at each other. This wasn't part of the plan. The pause was supposed to end. The bowl was supposed to be enough. But Vala doesn't care about plans. She cares about recognition. About name. About not being the one child who stayed in the margins, while others argued over goats and ghosts. Let's take a dark little detour. In one tale recorded by an Icelandic merchant, there was a noblewoman named Ira who returned home after 20 years abroad, claiming to be the long-lost daughter of a drowned warlord. Her proof? A scar shaped like a fishhook on her ankle, a lullaby no one had sung in decades, and a necklace made from his battlefield teeth she'd collected before the tide took him. The elders hesitated, but her story was too vivid. She inherited the farm, then sold it, then vanished again. Some say she was an imposter. Others say she was the only one who remembered his real name. Back in our fireless longhouse, Leif is the one who steps forward now, bowl still in hand. Then speak, he tells Vala. Tell us what he said. What he gave you. If it matters, let it matter here. It's not a challenge. It's an invitation. And that's what makes it so dangerous, Vala nods. She speaks of a winter where the snow buried the house to the roof, where wolves came to the door, where Thorbjorn, half mad from fever and whiskey, knelt beside her cot and whispered stories about gods who swallowed their own hearts to stay alive. He told me I would outlast them all, she says. Not because I was strong, because I was silent. And that silence, she's broken now. You feel something shifting again. Not in favor of anyone, but away from certainty. Because Viking inheritance was never about who shouted first. It was about who lingered last, who outwaited grief, who returned when the fire had gone out and everyone thought the saga was over. Time. For your night's erotic absurdity, there's a story in the history of sexuality about a woman named Sifla who was excluded from her family's inheritance due to scandal, specifically betting a foreign trader during a thunderstorm. When her brothers tried to erase her from the family scrolls, she showed up at the thin assembly in nothing but a cloak and declared herself the storm's bride. She then recited from memory every line of her father's war songs, adding one verse none of them had ever heard, a secret verse, a lover's verse, one her father had only ever whispered once on the day he named her after the sky. She got the land. The brothers got nothing but shame and a bad song written about them. Back in our longhouse, Vala finishes speaking and hands the ring to Stenver. He turns it over, frowns, and nods. It's his, he says. Crude, but his. Now what? Do they split the legacy again? Add another heir to a pile already too tall? Or do they test her too? Leif makes the choice for them. Then she's part of it, he says. If the story has room for me, it has room for her. He offers the bowl. She doesn't take it. No, she says. You carry it, I'll carry the name. And just like that, something balances. Not resolved, but steadied. Because maybe inheritance isn't about one victor. Maybe it's about building a saga wide enough for every scar. Outside, the raven finally flies away, somewhere deep in the night. As the wind coils back around the longhouse like a lover who can't let go, a single candle flares back to life without warning. No one touched it. No one breathed near it. But there it is, sputtering like it's trying to speak, the wick clawing upward through the wax as though summoned by the weight of everything unsaid. The elders, now too tired to pretend they're in control, simply watch. And in that dim halo of light, someone laughs. Not a loud laugh. Just a sharp, dry exhale that cuts through the silence like a bone whistle. It's Freydis. Back from wherever she'd slipped off to, hair windblown, eyes clearer than anyone wants them to be. She walks in like she never left and drops a goatskin pouch onto the table with a dull thud. "Before you all crown Leaf, king of ghosts and riddles," she says, "you might want to hear this." Inside the pouch is a folded cloth, yellowed and stiff from age. When she unrolls it, the room leans forward as one. It's a map, not of lands, not of seas, but of lineage. A family tree drawn in ink so fine it looks etched, names scribbled in Old Norse, branches tangled like storm-tossed roots. At the top is Bjorn, and beneath him 6 lines, not 5, not 4, 6. He kept this hidden in his box of tools, Frady says. Tucked behind a false panel, I found it by accident. Thought it was nothing. Then I saw the mark. There it is in the margin, just beside her own name, a small rune, a mark of favor. Not a full inheritance seal, but a symbol known in some coastal clans to mean protected. Not merely named, but guarded. He didn't want me to rule. She says, he wanted me to survive. And in that moment, you understand what this map really is. Not a declaration, but a defense. Not about who leads, but who is left standing when the others fall. Now here's where things slant sideways. Because Viking law, as chaotic and regionally inconsistent as it was, had one deeply embedded pattern: the idea of protection as inheritance. You didn't just pass down lands and swords. You passed down burdens, promises, shields. If a father marked a child with the rune of protection, it meant they were to be spared the worst of the legacy. Not cut out, sheltered from the infighting, from the blood feuds, from what we're witnessing right now. Historians still debate how enforceable such marks were. Some claim they carried spiritual weight only. Others argue that in tight-knit communities, they were honored with more seriousness than even written wills. But either way, Frady's is no longer just a contender. She's the linchpin. The unburnable name. Sven, who's been silent for longer than anyone expected him capable of, finally stands. His face is unreadable, not rage, not defeat, something quieter. So I was never supposed to have it, and she was never supposed to want it. He nods at Leaf, but you get it. All of it. His voice doesn't crack. That's what makes it worse. You'd better make it worth it. And with that, he turns and walks toward the door. No one stops him, not even Frady's. Because some exits are earned, not negotiated. Now, for something wonderfully indecent, a tale from the coastal tribes of northern Scotland, where a chieftain's inheritance was once decided by seduction. 3 daughters, all legitimate, all fierce. Their father, tired of choosing, declared that whichever daughter could seduce the rival clan's chieftain without losing her dignity or her clothes would be named heir. The eldest wrote poetry. The youngest played the harp, but the middle daughter, she taught him chess and beat him twice. When asked what seduction had to do with pawns and kings, she replied, "Desire isn't always flesh. Sometimes it's power you don't even know you're giving away." She inherited the clan. He married her. And they never played chess again. Back in the longhouse, the elders have grown quiet again, not from indecision this time, but from exhaustion. The fire's gone. The snow taps gently at the shutters, and still Leaf holds the bowl. But now it feels lighter. Not because the weight has shifted, but because the hands holding it are steadier. Vala sits beside him, not claiming, just witnessing. Frady's too has returned to her seat, not to lead, but to remain. Because staying is its own kind of strength. Stenver, seeing that his moment to be dramatic has passed, simply nods. "Then we mark the legacy in this way," he says. Leaf, holder of word and bowl. Frady's, keeper of the thread. Vala, bearer of the forgotten blood. The rest may step forward or may vanish, but the story continues. It's the closest thing to a verdict anyone's going to get in now. A quirky gem for your mind. In some rare Icelandic family disputes, a goat was made the symbolic arbiter of land. They'd place a boundary stone at the center of the field in question, release a goat, and whichever side it lingered near became the winner. The logic? Goats are drawn to places of peace. And goats, as it turns out, are better judges than most men. One particularly stubborn goat chose the same family side 3 years in a row, cementing their land claim and becoming something of a local deity. When it died, they buried it upright, gave it a stone, named it Grey-Nose the Wise. Back in the present, no goats are deciding this fate. But the candle, yes, the one that relit itself burns brighter now. No wind dares snuff it, as if the room itself has agreed at last on something. Leaf looks around at the faces still lit by that tiny flame, some tired, some relieved, some unreadable, but none hostile. Not anymore. And in this silence, you begin to realize something profound. Inheritance isn't about victory. It's about survival, about memory, about choosing not just who gets the land, but who gets the burden of keeping the past alive without letting it rot. Leaf, quiet as ever, finally says, "Then let me carry it. Not for the gold, not for the name, but because someone has to remember what it cost." And in the flicker of the last flame, you believe him. It starts with a lie. Not the loud kind. Not the kind shouted in council or scribbled into wills, no. This lie comes wrapped in fur and perfume, slow and smiling, tucked into the shadows like a dagger in a feast hall. The kind of lie that wears charm like a second skin. You first notice him when the door swings open a second time that night, long after everyone else had settled into the half-sleep of exhausted relief. He walks in unannounced, unbothered, uninvited, and yet somehow he owns the air. No snow clings to his cloak, no cold flushes his cheeks. Just calm, collected warmth. His name is Rurik, and from the moment he steps into the glow of the candlelight, you know exactly what he is. Trouble, dressed as kin. He doesn't speak right away. He smiles first, lets the tension bloom. "Did I miss the fighting?" he says, voice like honey steeped in old mead. A few of the elders squint. One recognizes him, mutters a name they haven't heard in years. Rurik of the Southern Sound, fostered by Thorbjorn's brother, raised far from this valley, but never too far to forget the taste of inheritance. And now here he is, with perfect timing and a pouch full of stories. "I heard there was a bowl," he says, gesturing at Leaf's hands. "And I figured, why not add another tale to it?" This is where it turns theatrical. Rurik doesn't slam evidence on the table. He doesn't brandish tokens or letters or ancient combs. He tells a story. A love story. One no one expected. One so smooth it might as well be silk slipping over sharpened bone. "I met Thorbjorn in Uppsala," he says, when he came for the Harvest Council. "He was tired, bored, lonely. We drank. We talked." He pauses. "And eventually, we stopped talking. You could hear a toothpick drop. He waits, lets it sink in. He called me his echo," Rurik says. "Said I reminded him of what he could have been if he'd been braver. If he'd been free." He doesn't say it outright. Doesn't say they were lovers. But the implication curls around the rafters like smoke. And in Viking culture, implications carried more weight than most people dared admit. Historians are divided about male intimacy in Norse society. Some sources paint it as taboo. Others suggest quiet acceptance under the right circumstances, especially when tied to wisdom, poetry, or magic. Odin himself was rumored to have engaged in shape-shifting trysts. Loki changed genders more than once, but in public discourse, it was always a risk. And that's what makes Rurik dangerous, not just because of what he says, but because he says it without shame. Freydis narrows her eyes. "And what is it you want?" she asks. "A poem? A goat? The bowl?" Rurik just laughs. "None of it. I just want my part of the story back." But that's not true, not even a little. Because charming men never walk into inheritance disputes empty-handed. They walk in with options, and this one? He's already made himself unforgettable. And now, for a historical curveball. In a 10th century saga known only in fragments, there's a man named Hallgrim, a bard who claimed to have shared a bed and a soul with a chieftain during a long winter of exile. When the chieftain died, Hallgrim arrived unannounced to claim the man's flutter, a simple token, but rumored to bring clarity to whoever played it. The court scoffed until he played it, and every dog in the village stopped barking. The elders gave him the flute. He walked away smiling. The following spring, he returned and married the chieftain's niece. The flute was buried with him. Back in the longhouse, Leif still hasn't moved. His fingers tighten around the bowl. Rurik walks a slow circle around him, like a skald sizing up the next verse of a poem. "You look like him," he says, "but you carry it like it's going to break you." Leif finally speaks. "And you carry nothing because you gave it all away." For the first time, Rurik's smile cracks. Just a hairline fracture. But enough. Because even the slickest ghosts bleed when you call them by their real name. "Careful," Rurik says. "Names stick." And Freydes, who's had enough of riddles, cuts in with a knife of her own. "If you're not here to claim, then why are you still standing?" Rurik sighs, reaches into his cloak, pulls out a single scrap of parchment, sealed with wax shaped like a serpent devouring its tail. He tosses it to the table. "Because he wrote me a verse," he says, "and in it, he called me his final secret. No one touches it. Not yet. Because in a world built on what people remember, a secret made visible is a weapon no one wants to be first to draw." Here's a final twist of the knife for tonight's romantic interlude. One tale from the Volga trade routes tells of a Viking diplomat who fell in love with a Persian noble. They exchanged tokens. He gave her a bracelet of walrus ivory. She gave him a scroll with a poem written in 3 languages. When he died, she arrived at his burial in full mourning garb, walked barefoot across the snow, and dropped the scroll into his fireboat. The local jarl declared her grief proof enough of inheritance. She was given his horse, his bow, and his silence. Back inside, the longhouse is still. Not because it's over. Because no one knows what to do with a secret that might be truer. The many-spoken vow. Leif doesn't open the parchment. Not yet. He places it on the bowl's rim. "If it's a verse," he says, "let it wait until morning. Let the gods read it first." Rurik bows and finally steps back. But not far. Never far. Because some people aren't storms. They're tides, quiet, relentless, pulling everything toward them in slow, invisible shifts. And outside, as the snow deepens, the candle finally gutters out. Not because it's finished. Because the night has decided it needs no more light. It begins again before the sun rises. Not with thunder. Not with weeping. But with the sound of pages turning soft, deliberate. Each flip a blade across the silence. Leif sits alone now, long after the others have slipped into dreams or nightmares or whatever realm waits between guilt and frostbite. The bowl rests beside him like a sleeping animal, and in his hands is the parchment Rurik left behind. The seal broken, the words exposed. He reads it once, then twice. Then lets it fall into his lap like it burned him. Because what's written there isn't just verse. It's confession. A love letter disguised as prophecy. "I have called many sons," it begins, "but you are not my shadow, you are my reflection. If you find this, know that I gave my truth not to the loudest, but to the one who would wake to hear it whispered." Below the lines, a name scratched in haste. Not Rurik's, Thorbjorn's. Not a signature, but a carving. Raw. Final. Leif doesn't weep. He doesn't sigh. He simply stares forward into the blackness beyond the walls, where the snow still falls. Like the sky is unraveling thread by thread. You can almost see it with him, the childhood spent in half light, The years of not being enough, or being too quiet, or being called accident by brothers who never quite looked at him straight. And now this. The truth wrapped in a lie. The lie wrapped in a secret. The secret left too late. By the time the others return to the hearth, the fire's been rebuilt. Leif has done it alone, with the calm of someone who's already made his decision. The bowl is no longer beside him. It sits in the center of the room, and inside it, the parchment burns, slow, controlled. Every curl of smoke spelling release. Rurik watches, expression unreadable. "You didn't have to burn it," he says. Leif answers without looking. "It wasn't mine to keep. It was his." Freydis arrives next. She says nothing, just pulls her cloak tighter and watches the flames devour the last of her fathers. Vala sits beside her, their shoulders touching. A quiet alliance, formed not through blood or politics, but through weariness. Stenver approaches the bowl as the last edges of parchment blacken. "You've made your choice," he says. "But do you understand what it means?" Leif nods. "It means the legacy starts clean. No secrets, no scraps, just memory and fire. And this moment is where everything finally begins to thaw, because Viking inheritance wasn't about precision. It was about conviction. Who had the strength to carry not just the burden of title, but the responsibility of forgetting what needed forgetting, and remembering what must never be lost. Let's take a breath and detour into something equally weighty in One East Norse. Manuscript. There's a story of a woman named Brynhild who inherited a mountain pass from her dying uncle, not through a will, but through a whispered phrase passed into her ear as he died. The phrase was a place name, known only to the two of them. She spoke it aloud at the assembly. No one could prove it was real. No one could prove it wasn't, but the weight of it, the specificity, the way her voice caught on the syllables convinced them. She kept the pass, and later, a village grew there. Named not for her uncle, but for her. Back in the longhouse, Freydis finally speaks. "Then we seal it. Here. No more names. No more claims." Her voice is hoarse, but resolute. Stenver nods. The elders agree. Even Sven, returned now from whatever edge of self-pity he'd wandered to, simply nods. "Let the gods judge the rest," he mutters. "And maybe they will. Or maybe the gods have already moved on. And now, your decadent historical side dish. According to Peter Webb, one Norse chieftain in Jutland solved an inheritance dispute by marrying off all 5 claimants to each other in a circular bond too. Brothers married 2 sisters, and the 5th became legal guardian to all their combined children. It was absurd, chaotic, beautiful, and it worked. The land stayed unified. The saga gained an entirely new generation of petty drama. Everyone got something. Especially the goats. Back in our hall, the mood shifts. Not celebration, but release. The kind of quiet you get only after surviving something that almost destroyed you. Leif rises and does something unexpected. He passes the bowl to Runa. She gasps softly. "He would have wanted you to keep it," he says. "You were there when he had nothing. Let it rest with someone who doesn't need to claim it." And Runa, ancient, nearly forgotten, accepts. Cradles the bowl in her wrinkled arms like it's a child. Outside, the wind softens, the snow slows. And for the first time in many nights, the roof doesn't creak. It exhales, because the inheritance is no longer a curse to fight over. It's a story to carry. And for once, the story has room for everyone still standing. No one speaks as dawn begins to bleed into the cracks of the longhouse. Walls, it doesn't arrive like light, it arrives like memory, slow and unwelcome. Stretching fingers of gray across fur and ash, reminding everyone that the world outside hasn't stopped just because this room rewrote its future. The shadows shrink reluctantly. The floorboards groan beneath the weight of fatigue, and the fire is little more than a hum. But the people who remain Leif, Freydis, Vala, Runa, even Rurik, are now stitched together by something more binding than blood or law: survival. There's no crown, no feast, No one dancing. Just the breath of a house that's endured. And yet, even in this strange calm, the story isn't quite done. Because as every Viking knows, legacies don't die at dawn. They echo, and sometimes, the most dangerous part of an inheritance is not what you receive, but what others believe you've stolen. Which is why, just as the goat bell rings outside, sharp and high, and strangely desperate, another figure stumbles into view. Younger than most expected, covered in frost, and carrying something wrapped in sheepskin and tied with black cord. His name is Brander, the blacksmith's boy, no relation. No claim, but what he says next sets everything on fire again, I found. This by the fjord, he says, dropping the sheepskin onto the table. It unravels with a thud, a ledger, Thorbjorn's ledger, the one believed to have burned with his old barn 2 winters ago. It's singed, it's warped, but it's real. The rune of the house carved into the spine. And inside, in a hand that's unmistakably the jarl's, records, trades, names, promises, and tucked between 2 pages, brittle and creased from salt, a single sheet listing his intended division of land dated a month before he died. Suddenly, every breath in the room tightens. Again, because this is the one thing no one expected. A definitive document. The thing that could unravel everything they just endured. Freydis reaches for it first, her hands trembling. She reads it aloud, each name etched in crude script. Leaf granted. The forest ridge and southern pasture. Freydis, the hall and its surrounding ground. Vala, the shoreline and fishing rights. Inga, a piece of the eastern hill. Sven, the livestock and outer barns. Even little Raffin is listed given the Winter Lodge and its orchard dot. No one is left out. But that's not what stuns the room. It's the final line. A single phrase, written sideways in the margin, barely legible. And for all of them, let the stories be told fairly. That's it. No elaborate signatures, no blood seals. Just a man's last attempt to stop his legacy from tearing itself apart. Historians still argue whether such documents discovered posthumously and outside the formal thing process would be accepted as binding. In most cases, they were not. But what they often did was reshape the social contract. A written will, especially one recovered in dramatic fashion, could change how the community viewed the heirs, not legally, but reputationally. And in Viking culture, reputation was everything. Runa is the one who breaks the silence. She claps her hands once, sharp, then he meant for all of you to carry it, together. And just like that, the narrative shifts, again, not from conflict to clarity, but from fracture to something else entirely, something almost hopeful. Leaf steps back from the fire, then we follow it, he says. Not because we must, but because he tried. His voice is low, hoarse, but solid. Vala adds, he was many things. But maybe he didn't want to be a curse. Rurik, surprisingly, quiet now, nods. He was never good at endings. But this feels like one he meant. And here's your final sensual aside for the night. In one Baltic love tale, a warrior named Alrek left behind a map for his lovers, not of land, but of places where he'd kissed, each one etched with riddles and symbols. When he died, 3 women came forward with matching tokens, and together pieced the map into a complete story. They shared the inheritance, not out of obligation, but because they each held a piece of his truth. The locals called them the cartographers of desire. Their tale became a fireside epic. Back in our hall, no such map is needed. Just the ledger. Just the bowl. Just the choice to believe that not every inheritance must end with blood on the walls. Freydis lifts her hand, not in command, but in offering. Let this be the last night we carry it like a wound, she says. Let tomorrow be for building, not bleeding. Outside, the wind finally stops, not dies, just rests. Like even the gods have decided to let this house breathe. Inside, No. One moves to argue, not this time. Because somehow, in the slow burn of memory and the long ache of honesty, something new has taken root. Not peace, exactly, but possibility. And in the faint morning light, as the ash settles and the goats begin to bleat for food, Leaf gathers the ledger, the bowl, and his thoughts. Then we begin again, he says. And this time, we tell the whole story. There's a particular silence that only exists at the end of a very old storm. Not the stillness of peace, not the hush of exhaustion, but something else, like the world is listening to see what you'll do next. That's the silence that greets the new day in the longhouse. Not a sound from the wind, not even from the goats. As if nature itself is giving space to the people inside, who just survived something heavier than winter. The fire, long since reduced to a scatter of quiet embers, glows just enough to remind everyone of what it cost to keep it burning. And standing there, caught between yesterday's ashes and tomorrow's breath, is Leaf, son of no oath, heir of too many promises, and now the one left holding what remains of Thorbjorn's world. He doesn't speak. Not right away, he moves. Slowly, gathering the items that once felt like weapons and wounds. The serpent ring, the bowl of bone, the map with its protection rune, the comb Runa never knew was carved for her. One by one, he sets them on the center table, not as claims, but as artifacts. Relics of a story that is now his to carry, not dominate. Around him, the others do the same. Vala brings the iron ring. Freydis places the faded love letters. Runa adds her shawl, the one she wrapped Thorbjorn in during his last fever. Even Sven, scowling bitter, adds a single lock of fur from their father's old wolfhound. It's small. It's enough. And as these objects settle on the wood, something happens. Not magic, not miracle, but meaning. A quiet reweaving of the legacy, not into law, but into memory. Into shared ownership. Because maybe inheritance was never about who won. Maybe it was about who stayed. Stenver is the last to approach. He doesn't add anything. He simply nods. Then it is done, he says. The line remains. And in those 3 words, the weight shifts. The longhouse no longer groans with the burden of too many truths. It stands, ready. And now, as promised, the wind down begins. The fire is soft now, its last embers whispering against the stone like tired storytellers curling into dreams. The longhouse is quieted, not with fear or conflict, but with a kind of earned stillness, the hush that comes only after every secret has been spoken, every wound exposed, and nothing left but the slow exhale of people who made it through. You let yourself lean back now, shoulders relaxing for the first time since this night began. The air around you is warmer somehow, though the snow still drifts past the shuttered windows, and the roof still creaks with the weight of old ice. But inside, within these worn wooden walls, something has thawed. You imagine the bowl now resting in Runa's arms, carried like a child that never cried. You picture Leaf stepping into the morning, not as a king or conqueror, but as a caretaker of the stories that nearly tore his family apart. And you see Freydis, strong and sharp, watching the snow fall with eyes that miss nothing. Vala standing. Beside her, no longer the forgotten. Even Rurik, yes, even him sits with his back against the wall, humming something soft, something unfinished. The names have been spoken. The past has been claimed, not by one voice, but by many. And whatever comes next, division of land, planting of seed, the rebuilding of what was nearly lost, will grow from something real. Something earned. So now, close your eyes a little if they haven't already begun to droop. Let the soft flicker of imaginary firelight wash over your face. Let the echoes of Thorbjorn's mistakes, his loves, his secrets, drift back into the dark where all old tales eventually sleep. And breathe deeply, slowly, knowing that in the heart of a frozen world, even the coldest legacies can be reshaped, not through power, but through presence. Not through blood, but through memory. The storm has passed. The hearth still burns. And the story, now finally told in full, can rest.